I'm going to talk about the ISIS and the factors led to its creation. First of all, I'm going to tell you who is ISIS. It is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Syria, as the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. That means Sham in French language, Levant, or in English. Or then it changed its name to Islamic State or to Caliphate State. And by its Arabic language, it's Daesh, that means Devlet al-Islam fi Iraq wa Sham, and is a Salafi jihadi militant group and unrecognized de facto state that follows a fundamentalist Wahhabi doctrine. ISIS gained global prominence in 2013 during the Syrian civil war, and in early 2014 when it drove Iraqi government forces out of key cities in western Iraq and in northern western Iraq. The roots of ISIS are based on years before the Syrian conflict. Most of the people knew ISIS during the Syrian civil war, but their roots are maybe 10 years before from the Syrian civil war. These are the leaders of ISIS. The first was Abu Musab Zarqawi, the Jordanian militant. He was leader of Tawhid al-Jihad, and Jihad. It operated in Iraq, but it was founded firstly in Herat, in Afghanistan, Herat near Iranian border, and his vice, how can I say, like a vice, his helper, Abu Enes al-Shami, also he is a Jordanian. Then this is the first Islamic State of Iraq. It was Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. It was an old Iraqi policeman, and his helper also the Egyptian jihadist Abu Hamza al-Masri. And you have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the actual leader of ISIS, that called himself a caliph, and he is the other commanders of ISIS. He's the Samir al-Hilafi, as known as Haji Bakr. He was old member of Iraqi intelligence and Iraqi army. This is the spokesman of ISIS al-Adnani. This is the other commandant. His name was Turkmeni, I don't remember the name. And the Abu Umar al-Shishani, he was also the commander of ISIS. He was from Georgian army. So I'm going to tell about the roots of ISIS. The group was founded in 1999 by Jordanian Salafi jihadist Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, as known as Ahmed al-Faleila, and under the name Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, the Organization of Monotheism and Jihad, the English version. Following the 2003 occupation of Iraq by Western forces, al-Zarqawi and Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad achieved a notoriety in the early stages of the Iraqi insurgency for their attacks on Shia mosques, civilians, Iraqi government institutions, and the United States-led coalition forces. In October 2004, when al-Zarqawi swore loyalty to Osama bin Laden, and also this group was the first group that were filming the kidnapping and beheading the hostages in Iraq, foreign hostages. In October 2004, when al-Zarqawi swore loyalty to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, he renamed the group the Organization of Jihad based in Mesopotamia, like Tanzim al-Jihad fi Rafidain. It was the Arabic name. In a letter to al-Zarqawi in July 2005, Al-Qaeda's then deputy leader Ayman al-Zawahiri outlines a four-stage plan to expand the Iraq war. The plan included expelling United States forces from Iraq, establishing an Islamic authority as a caliphate, spreading the conflict to Iraq's secular neighbors, and clashing with Israel, which the latter said was established only to challenge any new Islamic entity. Also, the group was criticized by Al-Qaeda itself, by Osama bin Laden and by al-Manzamari, by using the very brutal attacks to Muslim Shia civilians. In January 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq joined with several smaller Iraqi Sunni insurgents groups under an umbrella organization called the Mujahideen Shura Council. Few months after death of Zarqawi by United States airstrike on Bakuba city of Iraq in 12 October 2006, Mujahideen Shura Council united with the 3 smaller groups and 6 Sunni tribes to form the Mutaibin coalition. A day later, Mujahideen Shura Council declared the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq, comprising Iraq's 6 mostly Sunni Arab governors with Abu Omar al-Baghdadi as its Emir, the governor, Emir, and al-Masri Minister of War with the Islamic State of Iraq's 10-member cabinet. The group was active in Diyala, Salatin, and Anbar provinces and had control in rural places. After Abu Omar became a leader, the group, dominated by foreign jihadists, has now become more and more dominated by Iraqi citizens. By increasing of operation of Iraqi army, the organization began to operate underground in years, I think, in 2008-2009. After also they killed the Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. After the death of Abu Omar al-Baghdadi and al-Masri, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became a leader and replenished the group's leadership by appointing former Iraqi military and intelligence service officers, Saddam's members, who had served during Saddam Hussein's rule. These men, nearly all of whom had spent time imprisoned by United States military at Camp Buka, came to make up about 1/3 of Baghdadi's top 25 commanders, including Abu Abdurrahman al-Bilawi, Abu Ayman al-Iraqi, and Abu Muslim al-Turkmeni. One of them, a former Colonel Samir al-Kilavi, as I showed you in photo, also known as Haji Bekir, became the overall military commander in charge of overseeing the group's operations. Al-Hilafi was instrumental in doing the groundwork that led to the growth of ISIL. During the Syrian War, following the outbreak of Syrian civil war, al-Baghdadi began sending Syrian and Iraqi Islamic states of Iraqi members experienced in guerrilla warfare across the border into Syria and to establish an organization there under the name of Jabhat al-Nusra li Ahli al-Sham, or Nusra Front. It established a large presence in Sunni majority Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Idlib, and Aleppo provinces, led by a Syrian known as Abu Muhammad Jolani, which is now the leader of the Hareketu Tahrir Sham. Is operating in Syria, former Nusra. This group began to recruit fighters and establish cells throughout the country. On 23 January 2012, the Syrian group called itself Jabhat al-Nusra li al-Sham, more commonly known as al-Nusra Front. Al-Nusra grew rapidly into a capable fighting force with popular support among Syrians opposed to the Assad government. Establishment of Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. On 8 April 2013, al-Baghdadi released an audio statement in which he announced that the al-Nusra Front had established, financed, and supported by Islamic State of Iraq, and that the two groups were merging under the name Islamic States of Iraq and al-Sham. However, Abu Muhammad al-Julani and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leaders of Nusra and Al-Qaeda respectively, rejected the merger. Al-Julani issued a statement denying the merger and complaining that neither he nor anyone else in al-Nusra's leadership had been consulted about it. In June 2013, Al Jazeera reported that it had obtained a letter written by Al-Qaeda's leader Ayman al-Zawahiri addressed to both leaders, in which he ruled against the merger and appointed an emissary to oversee relations between them to put an end to tensions. That same month, al-Baghdadi released an audio message rejecting al-Zawahiri's ruling and declaring that the merger was going ahead. In October 2013, al-Zawahiri ordered the disbanding of ISIS, putting al-Nusra Front in charge of jihadist efforts in Syria. But al-Baghdadi rejected all Zawahiri's order, and his group continued to operate in Syria. In February 2014, after the 8-month power struggle, Al-Qaeda publicly dissolved any relations with ISIS. So I am going to explain now the factors that led to the creation of ISIS. First one is the occupation of Iraq by United States of Army, and the second one, Syrian civil war, and there are also social and political factors and ideological background. Occupation of Iraq by United States of America. The invasion of Iraq by the United States of America brought many problems. The massacres toward Iraqi civilians and tortures towards prisoners increased hostility against the occupation. Thousands of people whose their families had been killed by occupation forces, whose homes were destroyed and tortured in prisons, suffered serious traumas. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and many of today's ISIS commanders were previously held in prisons controlled by Americans. When you look at the backgrounds of these people, most of them were people who had a normal life, and they left prisons, Abu Ghraib and Kambuka. When they left the prison, they were all turned into radical jihadists. The invasion of Iraq by the United States was met with a negative reaction by the Muslim public opinion also. Many of the volunteers went to Iraq to fight against United States occupation, and most of them got radicalized by joining Salafi jihadists. As a result of occupation, an absence of authority emerged in Iraq. There was no terrorist organization in areas under control of Saddam. There was one terrorist organization in Iraq, in Saddam area, in Kurdish control zone. It was Ansar al-Islam, Al-Qaeda linked group. But in Saddam controlled areas, there were no any terrorist organization. Many jihadist organizations that have benefited from the void of authority have begun to leak Iraq. Jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda were also used by intelligence services of different countries. Saudi Arabia and Jordan indirectly supported these groups against Iranian domination in Iraq. Also, Syrian regime did not make a sound to these groups to use Syrian territories to pass in Iraq, because these groups also were fighting against United States forces. Because Bush government was saying always that after Iraq, the turn is in Syria for the occupation, and the Syrian government were silent for Iraqi insurgents basing in Syria. The Bush administration invaded Iraq under the pretext of the fighting terrorism, but this invasion has made Iraq the center of terrorism. As the American forces withdrew from Iraq, 1 million Iraqis were killed, and Iraq was divided into 3 parts due to the sectarian ethnic conflicts. Syrian civil war, the factors that caused this is just as in Iraq, the Syrian civil war created a lack of authority in Syria. Many jihadists and jihadist groups linked to Syria. ISIS, which had previously operated only in Iraq, benefited from the lack of authority in neighboring Syria this time. Arab and Western media provoked more events in Syria. Naturally, there has been a reaction in the world public opinion. As in Iraq, many Muslim volunteers went to Syria to fight against Syrian government forces. Unlike those who went to Iraq, those who went to Syria were not shown as terrorists in media, because before the fighters who went to Iraq were all showing as a terrorist. Of course they were, but these people who went to Syria, they were even portrayed as freedom fighters. Many imams who were silent during the invasion of Iraq started to make jihad calls for Syria in mosques. Intelligence services of many countries began to send militias and weapons to jihadist groups in Syria. The purpose of this was to use them for fighting against Bashar al-Assad and to exterminate all jihadists inside Syria. They couldn't guess foreign militants and weapons sent to Syria will pass into the hands of ISIS. As the conflict began between ISIS and other Syrian opposition groups, most of the foreign militants joined ISIS with their weapons. The organization that gained in the beginning of the Syrian civil war, the Syrian opposition and ISIS in mostly battlefields operated together. They were allied. The organization that gained weapons, militants, and the capital in Syria later turned to Iraq again by attacking the Iraqi cities, by taking the Ramadi, Mosul, and Tikrit, etc. And social and political factors that causes ISIS. American authorities were really uninformed about Iraqi region and society. They did biggest mistake by exporting Sunnis from government institutions by placing Shiites and Kurds in their place. They called these discriminations the Baathification of Iraq. As a result, many Sunnis got unemployed. After the United States invasion, the Shiites in Iraq seized the state institutions, and many Sunnis who were left unemployed joined the armed groups. Especially during the Maliki period, ex-Prime Minister of Iraq, discrimination against the Sunnis, practices of Iraqi armed forces and police marginalized the Sunnis. Tribal ties and bloodshed are common in Iraq. During the era of Saddam, Sunni tribes, especially in the Anbar region, had become a kind of autonomy. These tribes, whose privileges have been lifted by Maliki government and whose members have been killed, set off against the Iraqi government for revenge and cooperated with ISIS. For these reasons, ISIS took control of Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, and Mosul so quickly. Unlike Iraq, ISIS did not receive much support from Syrian civilians. In Syria, it was mostly supported by poor rural areas and by tribes who are relatives with tribes in Iraq. If we look at the ISIS map, we see in Syria they were controlling the regions close to Iraq and the rural areas in the north. Many Sunni oppressed in Iraq saw the ISIS as a savior and received support from rural poor regions in Syria by providing aids and infrastructure services. Increasing economic problems, especially in the Arab countries such as Tunisia and Egypt after the Arab Spring, have brought a younger people into the hands of Salafi groups. Most of the foreign fighters in the ISIS are Tunisians. The situation in Europe is no different. Most of the participants in the ISIS are either from poor Balkan countries or Muslims living in ghettos in France, Belgium, United Kingdom, etc. Islamophobia can be considered as a factor also. Many Muslims living in the West are exposed to Islamophobia. Exclusion from the society and increasing Islamophobia have also caused a radicalism among Muslims as a reaction. Ideological background, like all other jihadist groups, ISIS also follows the Salafi Wahhabi school. What is Salafi Wahhabism? It's a doctrine and religious movement founded by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, has been variously described as an ultra-conservative, fundamentalist, or Puritional, as an Islamic reform movement to restore a pure monotheistic worship. The term Wahhabism is often used polemically, and others commonly reject its use, preferring to be called Salafi. The Wahhabism is originated from Saudi Arabia, is spread all over the world by the organizations which were founded by Saudi Arabia. Wahhabism has become increasingly influential partly because of Saudi money and partly because of Saudi Arabia's central influence as a protector of Mecca and Medina, in the holy cities of Muslims. In the 1970s, with the help of funding from petroleum exports and other factors, Saudi charities started funding Wahhabi schools and mosques across the globe, and the movement underwent explosive growth. Salafi jihadism first spawned with the occupation of Afghanistan by United Soviet Socialist Republic. The CIA, Saudis, and Pakistani intelligence have sent thousands of jihadists to Afghanistan. Afghan jihad evolved to Al-Qaeda later, and to global jihad. Saudi-originated Wahhabi ideology continued to spread in the Balkans and the Caucasus and Southeast Asia. Thousands of people have begun to adopt this radical ideology. Al-Qaeda, who had gone to Iraq with the invasion of the United States, later evolved into ISIS. Thousands of people who have adopted the Salafi Wahhabi ideology around the world voluntarily joined ISIS. The conclusion: although the military campaigns are important factors to fight ISIS and similar organizations, but it is not a solution by itself. Sometimes even military campaigns can trigger more ISIS-like organization. For example, occupation of Iraq made so. We must get the bottom of the problem. We have to leave the political, social, and economic problems that have caused the creation of ISIS-like organization. As long as the proxy wars in the Middle East continue and these basic issues are not resolved, more ISIS-like groups will continue to emerge. That's all.